So there will be lots of our listeners who've been soaking up Dr. Matthew Nagra explaining things for some time. But for those who don't know you, how would you introduce yourself?
I'm a naturopathic doctor from Vancouver, Canada, and I spend a lot of time outside my clinical practice debunking nutrition misinformation online. So that's how a lot of people will know me is sort of response clips to whatever the carnivores are saying these days.
Can you say a bit more about what inspired you to dive deep into the science of protein, especially this long-standing debate between animal protein and plant protein?
I think it sort of came just with the territory of tackling a lot of the nutrition myths. Like one of the things that I think anybody eating a plant-based diet is eventually faced with is, where do you get your protein? And then from there, it used to be, well, there's all these foods, tofu and seitan and lentils and so on. But then it transitioned into, okay, but they aren't complete. And then it transitioned into, oh, but they aren't bioavailable. And so there's always like some other layer that gets brought up. And so ultimately to adequately respond to those concerns, I just sort of needed to really dive deep into seeing, is there really a difference? And if so, is it large enough to even worry about? And the answer seems to be no, but that's what ultimately, I guess, got me wanting to dive in.
Right. So can you explain a bit more then about how plant proteins actually compare to animal proteins?
Yeah, so let's go through those main concerns. The first question is, can you get the same amount of protein? And per calorie, tofu provides about the same amount of protein as 80-20 beef, so 80% lean beef. If you take the extra lean meats, that's comparable to textured vegetable protein, which is like a isolated or a more concentrated soy protein and is a great meaty substitute. Same thing with seitan. If you take dairy milk and replace it with soy milk, depending on the fat content of the milk, you can get about the same or even more protein from the soy milk. If you compare eggs to tofu, which obviously is people make tofu scrambles, you actually get more protein per calorie. So you can certainly match the amount of protein by just choosing higher protein plant foods. Then the second question of, well, are they complete? Do you get all of the essential amino acids? And for those who aren't aware, there are 9 essential amino acids. So these are the building blocks of protein that we need to consume through our food. And the claim is often that plants don't contain all of them. And that's just false. All plant foods, or at least all whole plant foods. I mean, I guess sugar, isolated sugar is technically a plant food. But all whole plant foods contain all of the 9 essential amino acids, but in varying amounts. So it might be true that if you were to only eat a single food, let's say you only ate beans, which have lower amounts of the amino acid methionine, you might end up short in methionine. But in reality, we all recommend eating a more varied diet, having nuts, grains, fruits, veggies, of course, which will add a little bit of protein, but then the legumes on top of that. And by doing so, you complement those amino acid profiles. It's not something that needs to be overly thought about as long as you have some variety throughout your day and you don't need to match at each meal like used to be thought. Now we get into the more complicated topic of bioavailability. So people will then claim, oh, but you don't absorb as much protein from plant foods as you do from animal foods. And this idea typically stems from a couple protein scoring systems called the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score, or the PDCAS, or the Digestible Indispensable Amino Acid Score, or the DIAS. And I will just very briefly explain what they do because we could really get into the weeds here. Basically, they feed different foods to either rodents or pigs, depending on the scoring system in most cases. And they'll measure how much protein comes or goes in and how much comes out the other end, or in the case of the DIAS score, how much makes it to the end of the small intestine. And the difference there between what came in and what came out is presumably how much was absorbed. Now, a couple problems with using that and extrapolating to humans is that we aren't rodents or pigs. We have different growth rates. We have different protein needs. We have different digestive tracts. Pigs are a bit more similar to humans than rodents, but obviously still not the same. And so we can't directly translate that to people. Now, the other concern, and this is the biggest concern that almost nobody mentions, is that the scoring systems don't just measure how much protein you absorb. They actually measure how much of the least available amino acid you absorb. So as I mentioned earlier, plant protein sources will have different amounts of these amino acids. So if you take beans, for example, and let's say a particular type of bean provided about 50% of your daily needs of methionine, but got everything else. Okay. If you absorbed even 100% of that, so the bioavailability is 100%, you would still only get a score of 50 because you would still only get 50% of your methionine. And now that is completely irrelevant if you were to eat more foods that are higher in methionine. It's like, and I make this comparison often, it's like if you were to have a report card and there were 9 subjects and you were to get straight like A pluses on 8 of those subjects, but then you only got a C minus on one of them, your report card would just read C minus. It wouldn't tell you anything else. It wouldn't average them out or anything. And so that's the big problem, and how these scoring systems are unfortunately stacked against plant protein sources when, if used in the context of a more varied diet, it's irrelevant. And these scoring systems were really designed to be used in places where there's food insecurity, where people are literally relying on 1 or 2 foods typically as their staples. This isn't relevant in a context of a diet where you have access to, a grocery store and you can have more variety there. And then just to wrap up protein, what ultimately matters is, do you get the same result? Do you get the same muscle and strength gains at the end of the day? We have now a couple controlled trials where one group will either be on a plant exclusive or vegan diet, or at least a near plant exclusive diet. And then the other group will be on a more omnivorous, more animal heavy diet, and they'll eat the same amount of protein, typically north of 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, while resistance training. And over the course of months, they get these same results, the same muscle and strength gains. So even if we were to say that there are these small differences in digestibility, which if we look at high quality proteins, the actual difference is a few percent maybe. Even if we consider that there are these tiny differences, they don't really pan out into differences in muscle or strength gains. So really it doesn't matter, which then turns to more of a discussion on like, well, which is healthier, which maybe we can get into.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I think we're coming on to another area there, which it doesn't matter how hard you're working with your Instagram and your reels and things to try and bust this myth of plant proteins being incomplete, it still seems to persist. And yet not much is said about the actual benefits of plant protein. So can we go in that direction now and maybe think about what can we actually say about the differences between animal-based and plant proteins in terms of the health outcomes?
Yeah, we have multiple now what are called substitution analyses. So these are large, generally very large population-based studies where they'll look at overall diet quality, they'll look at other lifestyle factors like smoking, exercise, etc. And then they'll try to, through statistical adjustments, match those variables up and look at what would happen if you take people with very similar diet quality, very similar other lifestyle habits, and maybe past medical history or family history. And you were to just swap out even a small portion, say 3% or 5% of calories from animal protein with plant protein. And in those cases, we see reductions in total mortality and cardiovascular disease mortality, in some cases cancer mortality, and a number of other causes as well. And that's extremely consistent, particularly if the animal protein is red meat or processed meat. So this goes for unprocessed or processed. There's a huge opportunity there on a population level to swap in even small amounts of protein from red meat with plant protein sources. Now, I do want to add a caveat that I don't think this necessarily means that the protein itself is inherently problematic. Whether the structure of the protein in the animal products is going to be more problematic than the plant protein. I think it's the package that it comes in. Because when you have plant protein, you're getting the fiber, you're getting the phytochemicals, and a bunch of other compounds there. Whereas with the animal protein, you're getting the heme iron, you're getting the dietary cholesterol, you're getting the saturated fat. Now, interestingly, even if you match up fiber intake and saturated fat intake, the plant protein still comes out on top. And that suggests more, some of the benefits of phytochemicals, perhaps some of the detriments of dietary cholesterol, even those less so than saturated fat, because those aren't typically accounted for in those models.
We're getting there. You've said it, that it's all about eating whole foods to get the package of the benefits. But for certain groups, would you be thinking about recommending protein supplements?
I think protein supplementation is an excellent idea. I think it's a super convenient mean of increasing protein intake. There's actually randomized controlled trials showing it can lower blood pressure. In some cases, can help with weight loss as well. potentially lower cholesterol levels. There are a number of potential benefits there. And I also think that especially for athletes who might be aiming to hit that, say, 1.6 gram per kilogram mark, it just makes it so much easier. You don't have to think about it. I mean, that's why all the meat eaters do it too, who are in the gym, even though they're eating a lot of those high protein animal foods. It's just because it's such a convenient thing to do. And then also, if we look at aging, protein intake potentially becomes more important with age once you hit about 60, 65 plus. And appetite typically declines. So how else are you going to try to cram in more protein? This is a great way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the debates that we're having in the UK at the moment, because we have a Plants First health campaign, which is about getting people to choose plant-based options potentially ahead of meat options when they're in hospital. And we've noticed how, like, in some hospitals, I think in must be maybe the Netherlands, they sort of say once people get to 3 days in hospital, the priorities change, and then you maybe are thinking about prioritizing animal protein, which is interesting if you could do it through plant-based protein supplements instead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And it's kind of interesting. I've another sort of debate, maybe a little bit tangential to that, but I think it brings up an interesting point, is I've actually heard arguments that I wouldn't say there's a super good argument against, that in the context of hospitalization like that, especially where appetite declines and it's really important to get the calories in, there's a real argument to be made for more like ultra processed foods that are richer in calorie density and easier to consume and lower in fiber, et cetera. Because the goal at that point is to get the calories in, get some nutrition in, get some protein in as well. But that is just something that I think is an interesting discussion that sort of doesn't really get talked about.
Well, I think we're going to come back to processed foods and protein. But before we get there, what are your preferred go-to protein sources?
Yeah, I mean, I eat tofu pretty regularly. Soy milk is my milk of choice. Again, mostly for the protein content, although I'm one of the people who actually does think it tastes better than oat milk. I feel like most people disagree with me there. So tofu and soy milk are great. I like seitan. I have made it a couple times. I usually buy it, but I feel like I need to make it more. It's actually not that hard. I eat some plant-based meats. If I do, I aim for those that are low in saturated fat and sodium, ideally. And then I eat plenty of legumes, lentils, beans, and especially lentil pastas. I feel like that's a really good sneaky source of protein as well. Usually very rich in fiber and iron on top of that.
Yeah, I had a bad experience with I think it was some lentil pasta quite recently. It sort of seemed to like completely dissolve in the pan, but I'm going to come back to it because some of them are really good.
So they cook really fast. That's the one thing.
That's the thing, isn't it?
They cook super fast. Like it's like 6 to 8 minutes, I think, depending on the package. And so if you do it too long, it turns into that. Yeah.
I'm sure I did that. Yeah, I don't want to put anybody off them, that's for sure.
Yeah. I've heard you speaking about lentil pastas because you're quite a gym goer, aren't you? And I know earlier you mentioned 1.6 grams of protein. Has the 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, has that sort of gone now? Are we advising different recommended quantities? And does that differ if you're an athlete versus a more sedentary person?
Yeah, so 0.8 grams per kilogram, still the RDA. Actually, I think there are some European countries that recommend higher for elderly, but I'd have to double check that. But generally speaking, 0.8 or 0.75, depending on where you are, is typically recommended. And that's based on nitrogen balance studies. So it's based on studies looking at the maintaining a positive nitrogen balance in the body, because amino acids or protein is one of the main sources of nitrogen. So that's sort of how they track it. However, we're learning as time goes on that there might be benefits to going higher. So if we look at bone fracture risk or osteoporosis risk, we see that there may be benefits to going up to even 1.1 or 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. We also see for endurance athletes, that's sort of around the minimum of what's recommended. And then for strength, the best outcomes are seen at about 1.5, 1.6. So I usually say 1.6. Now, on top of that, we see that higher protein intake is associated with lower risks of mortality and cardiovascular mortality, but that is specific to higher plant protein intakes. So when you separate plant and animal protein, you don't really see it so much with the animal protein. And so with all of that, I generally suggest that about 1.2 grams per kilogram per day is a good target for most people. For those looking to maximize muscle and strength gains, going a bit higher to 1.6 is also not a bad idea. But understand that the difference between 1.2 and 1.6 as far as actual gains is relatively modest. I mean, year after year, it could compound, 10 years down the line, that might be meaningful. But really 1.2, I think, is a really solid target for the vast majority of people. And there are many experts in the protein research realm who are now suggesting that. Dr. Stu Phillips would be one of the leaders in that realm who is on board.
Brilliant. That's really clear. Thank you. And you mentioned also about the research showing that muscle gains on plant-based diets versus animal-based diets are comparable. I was going to ask you, do you see a growing acceptance in the fitness community and hopefully the medical community about plant protein being just as effective for health and fitness?
Yeah, I'm starting to see shifts. One person who I'll shout out here is Alan Aragon. He's someone who very much used to favor the animal protein more, and maybe to some degree still does. I know he eats animal protein. He was recently on the Andrew Huberman podcast, and he actually sort of combated Huberman on this point and said, like, look, you can do it with plant protein as long as you're eating this amount and all of that. And it was really good to see that shift. I've seen some other people in that space as well who have come around. But then, of course, there's a group of individuals who are really still pushing back and don't seem to be able to let go of that. But I think there is a shift happening at the very least.
Yeah. And when you see people on social media or generally sort of confusing the protein matter and the message, if you dig into that, do you find that there may be campaigns backed by meat and dairy, for example?
I don't know. I mean, there certainly was a pretty big campaign when it comes to plant-based meats, but as far as the protein specifically, I'm not sure. It wouldn't surprise me, but I can't say I've really looked into it.
Yeah, sure. And do you have any particular concerns about biases in this area of research?
Oh, for sure. What's really funny on that front is there was a recent study measuring muscle protein synthesis. So this is like a measure of short-term changes in muscle growth. And they measured it, I believe, over 24 hours. And this was a study actually funded by the beef industry as well. And I think that they initially thought, in fact, they hypothesized in their text that the animal protein was going to outperform the plant protein. And then they found that it didn't. and so they had to report on it, which was really interesting. But that actually goes to show that just because there is an industry funding of a study doesn't mean that the results are necessarily going to be biased. What they can often do, especially if the researchers have some biases, is they can frame things in a certain way. So they can write a conclusion in a way that's maybe a little bit more favorable, but the numbers are still the numbers. I think there's this perception that people just fudge the numbers and make stuff up. That doesn't really happen. There are rare cases, sure. But what usually happens is the numbers are the numbers, and then they'll find a way to spin it in the text. And so what I do with a lot of studies, regardless of who's funding, in fact, I hardly ever even pay attention to that, is I just look at the methods, I look at the results, and then I form my conclusions based on that. I don't necessarily form my conclusions based on what the authors are concluding about those findings.
Yeah, absolutely. But I've also noticed some people try to find holes in very specific things. They'll just pinpoint on one, like, for example, leucine. Like, you'll see online people saying, oh, well, you can't get enough leucine on a plant-based diet. What do you say to those sorts of arguments?
I mean, so there are high leucine plant foods. Soy is another great one. Oats, surprisingly, are pretty high in leucine, depending on how many oats you're eating. There are other types of beans. I can't recall the exact values, but I know Simon Hill has a great chart of the leucine contents of different plant foods. One thing that is really important here is that there's a threshold to the effect that leucine has. So once you hit about 2 to 3 grams of leucine in a meal, it makes no difference for muscle protein synthesis. And as we have more research coming out about 24-hour cycles of muscle protein synthesis, it seems to be even less important. So for one, it's not clear how important that even is when it comes to actual muscle and strength gains over the long term. But even if we grant that it's something to consider, once you hit 2 to 3 grams in a meal, you don't need to do more. More isn't going to do anything. And that's totally achievable with plant protein sources, whether that's through a supplement or through soy sources or so on.
Okay, that's really good to know. Yeah, I mean, it's just lovely seeing online, the sort of plant-based strength athletes and all that they're achieving. I just wonder how else we can shift perception other than the examples of, people actually living the lifestyle and achieving so much athletically, really.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's unfortunately what sways people the most, is seeing the examples, the anecdotes, so to speak, as much as we want to talk about the research. One thing, though, I would love is like I maybe you guys know, maybe you don't, that I've participated in debates and stuff like that online, live debates or what have you, or recorded debates. I would love to have those types of opportunities with some of these people really pushing those sorts of messages. Because I think if you have somebody who really knows the data and is able to keep things on track, I feel like that's one of the debate skills that is lacking in some areas, where someone might be super knowledgeable, but they just get lost in the weeds because someone's just better at talking around points. But if you have someone who can keep them on track and really focus or hone in on the data, I think that's where you can really pinpoint, like, hey, this person doesn't really have a solid case for what they're presenting. But most of these individuals that I see promoting those messages are just not willing to have those discussions at all.
I heard something interesting about debating, though. I think it was at Vegan Camp Out, because I've always thought, I don't really have debating skills. Should I develop these? But then I've kind of put that on the back burner, because they said that for the two people taking part in the debate, even if you lose the debate, you still feel stronger in your original position. Maybe for people watching it, you might learn something. But in terms of changing the view of your opponent in the debate, even if you do a really good you've got all your arguments, it doesn't actually change their view, which defeats the object in some ways.
See, I that's not the objective for me. So now there's different ways you can say you win a debate. You can have them concede. Both parties need to be very honest individuals to do that. But you can also have them just concede to very bizarre positions, which I've done with some of my debate opponents, which just looks ridiculous to most people, and then they can kind of question it. But really what matters to me is, do the people watching, what do they take away from this? So for example, when I debated the carnivore Anthony Chafee, it was very clear that I was much more well-read on the research, that he didn't even know basic details of his own sources, that I had rebuttals to pretty much everything that he had to throw at me. And I got countless messages of people who were maybe on the fence, who were considering what he had to say, and who were no longer, because of that debate, because it was made clear that he didn't have a solid basis for his position. I honestly could not see any comments, like public comments or anything, that someone was swayed the other way. Obviously, his staunch supporters were throwing personal attacks at me. That's pretty much all they had. But I couldn't see anybody who was, say, more on the plant-based side, who was like, oh, you know what, he really convinced me, I need to try that out. It was only the other way. Those are the people that matter, because you might have, say, 40% of the people watching who are on my side, 40% on his side. And then there's that 20% in the middle who just want to see who presents the better arguments. And those are the ones that you can impact.
Can we talk about chicken? And I'm hoping this isn't a debate that one gets into with a patient, but as a healthcare professional yourself, how do you tackle those brief encounters that we have with patients where we're trying to find out a bit more about their diet, and that they tell you they've got a healthy diet, and then they mention the chicken salad and the low fat chicken, but basically they've swapped red meat for chicken, and your other healthcare professionals are in the camp of, well, it could be worse. We're making some progress here. How do you handle those encounters?
Yeah, so I think that's true. You are making an improvement by swapping out red meat for white meat, especially if it's lean, skinless, etc. However, when we look at, again, substitution analyses, we still see that the plant proteins tend to be better. What I try to emphasize, and of course there's an aspect of meeting people where they are, where they're at here. I try to get people to, especially if they aren't used to preparing things with plant protein, like, look, let's try a couple times a week. For dinner, this is your main protein source or whatever. And whether it's, again, it could be a lentil dish or a dal, or it could be beans, it could be tofu, whatever. And I try to incorporate some of those more often. It's more of like the, hey, add this versus, hey, take that out, and that sort of crowds some of that out. Now, again, is white meat, a couple times a week or something going to be problematic, or is it going to make a big difference whether you swap that with plant protein? Maybe not. But if it's an everyday thing, then you can make some leeway by shifting a bit more to plant protein sources, at least throughout the week.
What about if you were going to suggest to them maybe not to, they really like the taste of chicken, and you were going to suggest a plant-based meat alternative, and then you get the rebuttal that they don't like processed food? You've mentioned your preferred meat alternatives, they'd be low-fat ones. What can we say to patients about these processed meat alternatives?
It sort of depends if you want, how can you quickly respond to a patient, or do we dive deep into some of this stuff? So if I was replying quickly, I would say Well, not all processed foods are created equal. You have processed foods like whole grain products that tend to improve long-term health outcomes. Then you have processed foods like Coca-Cola and sausages, and those tend to be associated with worse outcomes. And the plant-based meat alternatives tend to be more on the healthy side, provided, again, you're managing saturated fat, et cetera. And then there might be some specific examples of, meat products or plant-based meat products that could be recommended in those cases. Now to get even into a little bit more detail, maybe for people who are wondering, is one thing that I always bring up is that nowhere in the definition of ultra-processed foods, at least the most widely accepted definition by the NOVA system, is the health impact of the food at all considered. It's not. A class 4 or group 4 ultra-processed food based on NOVA is simply a food that is produced through industrial processes made predominantly with industrial ingredients. You can take the same ingredients, essentially, that would be used to make a loaf of, we'll say, whole wheat bread in a local bakery, and that would be considered a group 3 processed food. Now you take those same ingredients and put them together through just industrial processing in a plant somewhere, and all of a sudden that could be considered an ultra-processed food. It's ultimately the same food. And so we have to look at the actual impact of these different foods. And when we look at it, and I published a paper on this last year in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology, when we look at the nutritional composition of plant-based meats and compare them to animal-based meats, we see less saturated fat, basically no dietary cholesterol. There are some products where they still include some eggs. I mean, these are rare, so they have some dietary cholesterol, but most have none. They have more fiber. Some of them are less calorie per serving. And then in the randomized trials, we see that replacing meat with the plant-based meat alternatives lowers LDL cholesterol, potentially lowers weight and waist circumference as well, based on at least a couple trials. So we're seeing positive impact from making that shift. And so that should lead us to believe that, these actually might be healthier alternatives, even though they're more processed than the animal food in most cases.
I'm actually going to come on to something very specific here, which is weight loss injections, which don't feel like a natural thing to do at all, but there's definitely not the same level of public concern about them. So I did want to ask about whether you had any thoughts about the idea that when you take a weight loss injection, there's already been some studies which show that you may lose more muscle mass than your average dieter, and what that then does for your protein requirements. Do these people need to be eating more protein? What are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, with the muscle loss, I mean, that's expected with rapid weight loss of any form. You always lose some muscle, you lose some fat, and because these are so effective at inducing weight loss, you're going to lose muscle. I mean, that's a fact of the matter. Now, to hold on to more muscle, upping protein intake. So during a calorie deficit, protein intake, optimal protein intake could be even higher than the 1.6 number I cited. Like you'll get into like 2 or even above 2 grams per kilogram. So that's one thing. But more important than that, by far the most important variable is resistance training. So if you engage in resistance training, stress your muscles, whether that's lifting weights or body weight exercises while losing weight, that is going to be the number one thing to help hold on to that muscle mass.
Do you think they're a good thing overall? Do you think we're taking things in the right direction?
Yeah, I do. So we can look at every diet camp ever over the past, I don't know how many decades. None of them have worked. We haven't seen a reduction in obesity rates in America. I mean, I don't know what the rates are in the UK. I know you're based out there. But we're seeing this year a downtick in obesity rates for the first time in forever. Now, can we conclude that that is definitely because of the GLP-1 receptor agonist? At this point, we need longer follow-up and all of that, but it's a good trend or a good change to see. Now, I know a lot of people, the Jillian Michaels of the world and so on, will push back and say it's the lazy way out, it's the easy way. And to that, I bring this up. We each have a predisposition to overconsumption or storing more calories. And some of us are more driven to consume more. Some of us are not satiated on typical servings. And some of us, myself included, I could walk by a McDonald's and not care. And then somebody else can walk by a McDonald's and it's just constantly on their mind. They don't want it to be, but it's just there. And that will be something that drives them to go in and potentially, overconsume. All these medications do is level the playing field. It's like if you were to have two people who are about to engage in a 100-meter race. And one of them just randomly, because of their genetics, it was decided that, you need to run this race with your feet shackled. I would advocate for, hey, we should unlock those shackles and let them run a fair race. And then someone like Jillian Michaels would say, no, just try harder. Right? That's the difference. I want to level the playing field. And that's all that these do. They allow people to make the changes they already want to make.
Matthew, I was going to ask you about creatine, because my social media feed makes me feel like I should be taking it. I'm not. What is it? And do I need to take it, please?
Yeah, so creatine is actually the most well-studied supplement or sports supplement in the world. It's been shown to improve strength, and this is predominantly because it is actually a fuel source. So the initial sort of explosiveness through whether that's like sprinting or lifting or what have you, that's often fueled by creatine. And we produce some creatine in our body, but we can increase the creatine content by taking higher doses through supplementation. Now, you'll have many animal food eaters saying, well, animal foods contain creatine, but they contain relatively small amounts. It's not going to be anywhere comparable to supplements, which again is why a lot of meat eaters, especially those who work out, take creatine. And yeah, it is super effective for improving strength output. Now, there's limited data suggesting that particularly in postmenopausal women, it may help with bone mineral density. There's some research, although very limited, suggesting potential cognitive benefits. And this seems to be more specific to people with concussions or under like sleep deprivation conditions, but still interesting to note. And there's some speculation that it might be even better for vegetarians or vegans because of the lack of meat intake, because we aren't even getting those small amounts that they might otherwise consume. I would say we need far more data there. I think some people make overzealous claims around that. But yeah, I think it's a good idea for anyone who's physically active. And I think it's potentially a good idea for other populations, just from a general health perspective for things that I mentioned. And the typical dose of creatine monohydrate, which is the standard form, is just 5 grams a day. It's just a tiny little scoop, typically, or a teaspoon. And ultimately very, very safe. It's been studied in a number of populations at much higher doses than is even recommended anyway.
When you say physically active, though, are we just talking about the recreational? I mean, I run, 5, 10K. I'm not a marathon runner. I like doing a bit of yoga, a bit of gym work. Is it necessary?
Yeah, so for aerobic activity like that, it's not clear that it has that much of an effect anyway. It's more so for things that require sort of greater power output or strength output. So when it comes to running, it would be like sprinting typically, or weightlifting. So is it necessary? It's absolutely not necessary. It's not essential. In fact, I actually wrote a paper on this with David Goldman. I would say it's just something to consider for the potential bone health benefits, for the potential brain health benefits, but certainly for the strength benefits if you are more serious about the resistance training side of things. Otherwise, it's sort of up to you. It's not something that I would say is necessary.
Thank you, Claire. Has that answered your question? Because we've always talked about creatine.
We do. And I was going to say, do you think you're going to take it, Daisy? But I guess that answers that. I mean, neither of us are sort of doing sprinting. I have people ask me about it, and I usually direct them to read something that someone else has written, because I'm not really sure what I should say. But I know that there's been a few people saying that it's caused them to put on weight or to get fat, not in a good way. Is that a risk?
It doesn't cause fat gain, but in the first month, if you're doing the standard dosing, you can gain a pound or two of the creatine/water weight because you hold creatine in muscles, and that carries weight. Now, that shouldn't appear like subcutaneous fat or that. It's in the muscles. If anything, it makes the muscles pop a little bit more. That's not really true, but it can add a little bit of weight.
Good. So we'll think about it. I'm still on the fence.
A bit of contouring is never bad.
This is very true.
And you mentioned, I mean, you said typical regimen is 5 grams a day.
Yeah.
Do you have to do a loading regimen, or can you skip that bit?
Making notes.
No, yeah. So some people, recommend doing the loading phase of like 20 grams a day for the first week just to maximize creatine stores. It's not necessary. The difference is if you did the loading phase for a week, you can maximize your creatine stores in a week. If you do the 5 grams a day, it takes about a month. So that's the only difference. It just takes a little bit longer to maximize the amount of creatine you're storing.
You've done your research on this, Claire, haven't you? Talking of research, Matthew, are there any sort of upcoming studies or innovations in plant protein that you're excited about to see coming up?
I actually really am interested in mycoprotein. So I know you guys have a lot of that over in the UK. I know it's down in the United States. I actually recently spent a weekend with Paul Shapiro from the Better Meat Co. Stayed at his house with his wife, Tony, who's a friend of mine, and was learning all about the company and what they're doing and just sort of some of the benefits of mycoprotein. Like one thing that I actually wasn't super aware of prior was that it's not actually an isolate. It's the whole food. It's got all the fiber. It's super high in iron and everything, as well as being super concentrated in protein. And so that's really interesting. And the research on mycoprotein so far is pretty positive as far as cardiovascular risk factors too. So I'd love to see more in that realm, particularly around like the fitness side. There's some research out there showing that it is a very high quality protein, but I'd like to see a little bit more there. And unfortunately, we don't have it in Canada at this point. Like we have basically none of the mycoprotein here. So I'm still waiting on that, even though it's been in the UK since I think like the 80s or something. That's an area that I'm pretty interested in. And then otherwise, like the cultured meat side, not something that I would personally want to consume super regularly, but it is something that I think can do a lot for the animals and the planet. But I think we're a little ways off from really bringing it to market in a big way. From what I understand, we're still 5 to 10 years at least. You never know; things ramp up pretty quick, so we'll see what happens.
The mycoprotein not being in Canada, is that a food licensing thing, or is there an opportunity there for an exporter?
It has to do with like the Health Canada claims or something. Apparently it takes a really long time to go through that process. So the Better Meat Co., who knows when they'll get over it. I know it's something that they're potentially looking at. Corn we don't have. Can't believe we don't still have it. I think I've seen certain products just at trade show type events, like where they'll have, samplings and stuff. I think I've seen some mycoprotein in those contexts, but that's about it. So yeah, it's some kind of issue with the sort of approval and how long it takes, and so still waiting on that.
Wow. Did you stock up then when you were in the UK?
No, I actually didn't, but I tried some. And then when I was down in the States, I had, when I was with them, I was having it pretty much every day just because it's their company, right? So had a lot of it.
Pretty sure we even have it for dogs here, actually.
Really?
Oh, really?
Mm.
Gosh. Well, if you don't have mycoprotein, we're going to ask you, what is your go-to plant-based dinner? We love asking our guests at the end of the episode what they're having for dinner.
Tonight I haven't planned. I actually have friends visiting, so we might honestly go out. I don't know. But normally I do stir fries pretty often. So like brown rice, then I'll just stir fry some veggies and tofu with like sometimes a sweet chili and some like soy sauce and just really simple. I used to very often, I actually haven't in a little bit, but maybe I need to get back to it. I used to do the lentil pastas with tomato sauce, and then I'd throw some veggies, chop some veggies in the sauce there. That was a really good, easy meal. So yeah, I do that pretty often, although it's been a number of weeks now. Sometimes, trying recipes from different books. I feel like I have a lot of friends in the sort of recipe creation space, so I just get all their cookbooks and then just kind of play around with different things there. So I'd say it's somewhat varied.
Have you come across Vegan Richer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my gosh, her recipes are gorgeous. And she's got this lentil, chickpea and quinoa bake thing that comes together like a curry. So that's what I'm having. And it's just got all the essential amino acids and all the right quantities, I think.
Yeah, no, I think I've had at least one of her recipes, but not a ton. Maybe I need to look more at that. But it has been good so far.
I was talking about these. I got sent 3 cookbooks from Canada because they do. Daisy put me onto this judging cookbooks competition, and actually it's based in Canada. So I got sent something called the Little Mountain Cookbook, and I don't think I couldn't actually mention a worse recipe for an episode that's based on protein. But what I'm mentioning is what I made earlier is the creamy potato soup, which is really delicious. And it's basically like, it's got carrots and celery and, a few blended cashews in there, but it's basically a load of creamy potatoes.
How much protein is in that?
I don't know.
Not much.
with a side of a tofu steak.
Every food has everything in it, if you eat the whole food. But so I don't want to take people away from that point. But obviously, it's not my go-to before a round of weightlifting.
Brilliant. Oh, Matthew, it's been really great chatting with you. If people want to know more about your work or follow you, connect with you, where can they find you?
You can find me on basically all the social media platforms. I'm definitely most active on Instagram at dr.matthewnagra, so just Dr. Matthew Nagra. Also have a website, drmatthewnagra.com, where I link things like this, the podcasts that I've been on, as well as some longer blogs and that sort of thing.
Perfect. We'll put those in the show notes. Yeah, I love watching your stuff on Instagram, and your debunking videos are brilliant. So keep going. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.